They say Walmart attracts all kinds, but I never believed it until that night. I'd taken the overnight shift, quiet, just me, a couple of cashiers, and the stockers. The graveyard shift didn't pay much, but it was enough for the time being, and the manager said we'd see fewer people than during the day. Easier, he'd promised. He was wrong. It was around 3 a.m., and I was working in the back, organizing a new shipment, when I heard something strange. A shuffling sound echoed from one of the aisles, and as I turned, I saw a figure drifting slowly down the main aisle. He was tall, wearing a grimy, oversized trench coat, and a mess of hair covered most of his face. He didn't look like any of the regulars, and at this hour, he shouldn't have been there. "Can I help you?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The man stopped, his head tilting toward me, but he didn't respond. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, wide and glossy, like he hadn't slept in days. Something about him was deeply unsettling, and I found myself frozen under his stare. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting strange shadows across his face. He was smiling now, a thin, twisted smile that seemed to stretch too far. I swallowed, deciding it was best to approach him. I took a step forward, and he immediately shuffled into one of the aisles, disappearing from view. "Sir, the store's about to close," I lied, hoping it would be enough to get him to leave. Silence. I reached the aisle he'd vanished down, but when I peered around the corner, it was empty. The air was thick, and I could swear it had suddenly turned colder. My hand clenched the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt, and I called out to Marco, one of the stockers. "Hey, Marco, you see anyone wandering around out here?" Nothing. After a few seconds of silence, there was a faint crackling sound, and then his voice came through. "Hushed, I thought I saw someone near the back aisles. Tall guy, right? Weird looking?" "Yeah, be careful, okay?" A minute later, I heard Marco's footsteps. He was just down the aisle, slowly walking toward me, his head turning left and right, scanning the shelves. "I don't see anyone now," he muttered. Then, just as he turned his back, I saw the figure appear again at the end of the aisle. He was closer this time, the light catching his face. A gaunt, sunken look, his eyes two pits of darkness. His head cocked to one side as he let out a raspy chuckle that seemed to echo around us. Marco didn't hear him. "He was just here," I hissed. Marco looked back, his brow furrowing. "Where?" But the man was gone again. I was sure I'd seen him there just a second ago, but now there was nothing but the aisle, the shelves stocked with random items, and the sound of buzzing lights above. Marco laughed, shrugging it off. "Probably just some guy trying to scare us. Let's just get back to work. He'll leave." I wasn't so sure. I forced myself to ignore it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But soon, as I stocked some shelves near the home goods section, I heard it again, that low, creeping laugh. This time, it was closer. I spun around, heart pounding, and there he was, crouched low, his fingers tracing the shelves in a slow, deliberate crawl. "Sir, you need to leave," I managed to say, but my voice barely came out a whisper. He didn't move. Instead, he lifted his hand, bringing one long, bony finger to his lips, as if to shush me. "Do you know what lurks in places like these?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and crackling like dry leaves. I took a step back. "Sir, please. I'll have to call the cops." His laugh grew louder, a dark, distorted sound that filled the empty aisles. "You think they'd come for you? You think anyone's coming for you?" I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. He started towards me, slow, deliberate, each step echoing through the empty store. In a rush, I turned and sprinted down the aisle, nearly colliding with Marco. His eyes went wide, but I didn't stop to explain. I just grabbed his arm and pulled him with me towards the exit. "Man, what's going on?" Marco whispered, his voice shaking. He's not human," I stammered, but even as I said it, it sounded ridiculous. Yet, the fear in Marco's eyes told me he knew something wasn't right. We reached the break room, slamming the door behind us. Marco locked it, but the thin door seemed like it wouldn't be enough. My pulse was racing, and in the tense silence we could both hear it, that slow, scraping sound, like nails dragging along metal. The lights in the break room flickered, casting our shadows across the wall. "Where is he?" Marco muttered, eyes darting around. I took a step back, pressing myself against the wall, heart hammering. We both jumped as the door handle rattled, slowly, then harder, as if someone was testing its strength. "Do you believe in things?" Marco whispered, his face pale. I didn't answer because I didn't need to. I could hear the man on the other side of the door, his voice seeping through like poison. Did you really think you'd leave here tonight? Suddenly the handle stopped rattling. We waited, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, Marco took a shaky breath and whispered, "Maybe he's gone?" I shook my head, but before I could say anything, the lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. We froze, listening. The only sound was our breathing, and then, in the pitch black, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room was empty, but I knew he was there, lurking in the shadows. Marco whispered, "We need to run. Now." But I couldn't move. The cold touch spread, wrapping around my shoulders, pulling me backward into the darkness. Marco's voice sounded distant, fading, as if he was moving further away. I felt the world tilting, pulling me into a place far from that Walmart break room, into a place cold and eternal. As I was dragged further into the darkness, his voice echoed around me, soft and mocking. "This store belongs to me, and now, so do you." The lights came back on, but I was gone, leaving nothing but silence behind. I took a job as a night stalker at Walmart to help cover some bills, and I liked the idea of working in relative silence. That changed one night when I noticed something unusual: the sound of a shopping cart wheeling around an aisle. It was subtle at first, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there, and at 2:30 a.m. we were supposed to be the only ones in the store. Ignoring it, I returned to unpacking boxes, telling myself it was just the sound of the HVAC system. But then the cart's wheels began to squeak louder, moving closer. I stepped into the aisle to check, my eyes searching for movement in the fluorescent light's unnatural glow. There was nothing. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to my imagination, until the sound started again, this time accompanied by the faintest whisper. "Help me." It was barely audible, like the murmur of someone right on the edge of consciousness. I whipped around, expecting to see one of my coworkers pulling a prank. "Very funny, guys," I called out, my voice betraying a hint of unease. No response. The silence that followed felt thick, unnatural. I shook my head and went back to my tasks, forcing myself to ignore the uncomfortable prickle on the back of my neck. About half an hour later, I went to the back storage area to grab more stock. As I reached for a box, my eye caught something strange in the corner of the room: a single dusty old shopping cart. It was turned on its side, the wheels bent like it had been abandoned for a long time. But this one was different. Tied to its handle was a dirty, yellowed tag that read, "Property of Marie Fisher." The name tugged at something in my memory. I remembered a local story my coworker Tony had mentioned, a story about a woman named Marie Fisher who'd gone missing while shopping at this very Walmart over 10 years ago. She was last seen late at night, wandering the aisles looking for her son who'd gone missing in the store when he was young. Supposedly, she went mad, mumbling about needing to find him before he finds her. Some said she'd wandered into the night, never seen again. But others swore she never left the store. I was so lost in thought that I almost didn't hear the whisper again. "Help! Me!" It was closer this time, right in my ear. I dropped the box, feeling my pulse race as I scanned the room. And there she was. A pale figure, thin and almost skeletal, stood at the far end of the aisle. Her hair was long and tangled, matted with dirt, and her skin was a sickly gray, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits staring straight at me, with an intensity that froze me in place. "Where? He?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the room, wrapping around me like a chill. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as she moved closer, her hands outstretched, reaching for me. Suddenly, Tony's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hey, can you bring some more toilet paper up front?" The spell broke. I blinked, and she was gone. The aisle was empty again, and the air felt like it had returned to normal. Shaking, I quickly grabbed the stock Tony needed and walked as fast as I could to the front. When I got there, he noticed my pale face and raised an eyebrow. "You all right, man?" he asked, looking concerned. I tried to laugh it off. "I think I just saw Marie." Tony's face fell, and he glanced around uneasily. "Man, don't joke about that. They say she haunts this place. She's still looking for her kid, you know? Some people say they've heard her calling for him, even after all these years." I didn't respond. I didn't want to tell him what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I went back to stocking the shelves, trying to shake off the experience. But as the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, and each time they sounded more desperate, more intense. Near the end of my shift, I heard the sound of a cart wheeling around again, closer this time. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there she was, pushing a shopping cart that wasn't there. Her movements were mechanical, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She looked up at me, her face twisted in despair, and spoke in a low, guttural voice. He was here. He was just here. I backed away, tripping over a stack of boxes, never taking my eyes off her. But as I fell, she vanished, leaving nothing but a chill in the air and the faint echo of her voice. Where is he? Where is he? I quit that morning, unable to shake the feeling that she'd follow me home if I stayed. As I left, I thought I heard that squeaky wheel again, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the empty aisles. I never went back, but sometimes on quiet nights I still hear her voice in my dreams, whispering, pleading. And I can never help but wonder if she's still there, roaming the aisles, searching. It was supposed to be a typical night shift, just another quiet evening with the usual few stragglers wandering the aisles and me, the lone cashier, manning the front. But that night was different from the beginning. The clock had just hit midnight, and for some reason, an uneasy stillness had settled over the store. I stood at my register, yawning, when I noticed a strange figure enter. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with wild gray hair and a thin, hunched frame. He wore an old trench coat that looked 2 sizes too big and heavy work boots that clunked with each step. But it was his face that caught my attention. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and held an intensity that seemed out of place. He didn't grab a cart or a basket, didn't look at any of the products on the shelves. He simply stared straight ahead and walked. I watched him drift down the aisle as if in a trance, each step slow and deliberate. Then he stopped, right in the middle of the store, standing perfectly still. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows over the shelves, and for a moment I swore I saw something shift in the darkness just beyond him. Curiosity got the better of me, and I leaned forward. Just as I did, his head whipped around, his gaze landing directly on me. My heart skipped a beat as his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted a bony finger and beckoned me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I knew I should have stayed behind the counter, but something about the way he looked at me, it was like I didn't have a choice. My feet moved on their own, taking hesitant steps toward him. As I got closer, I could see his eyes clearer, dark, empty, almost inhuman. They seemed to absorb the light around him, making the shadows deepen. Are you lost?" I asked, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. The man tilted his head, considering my question as if it were something foreign. Then he spoke, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "No, not lost. Waiting. Waiting for you." A sudden nausea gripped me and I took a step back. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. He was just an old man. Maybe he was confused or maybe he needed help. But there was something in the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. "Sir, I think you should go," I stammered, fighting the growing urge to run. But he just laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the empty store. "I can't leave. Not anymore." I took another step back, and that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing down the aisle, but not his. They were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. My eyes darted around, but I didn't see anyone else. The man's grin widened. "They're coming, you know. They've been here all along, waiting, watching." I turned around, fully intending to run, but the lights above flickered again and went out, plunging the entire store into darkness. I could barely see, but I could still hear the footsteps, now accompanied by soft whispers. Words I couldn't understand filled the air, layering over each other, growing louder with each passing second. A dim, sickly yellow glow came from one of the emergency lights at the end of the aisle, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I felt like I was being watched, like dozens of unseen eyes were fixed on me from every corner of the store. I spun around, desperate to find the old man, but he was gone. The aisle was empty, save for the faintest sound of his laughter echoing in the distance. My hands were shaking as I clutched my flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it around the store. The beam of light cut through the darkness, like revealing rows of empty shelves. Then I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisles, their forms shifting and swaying like they were made of smoke. They had no faces, no defining features, just dark, hollow silhouettes that pulsed and flickered with each heartbeat. One of them took a step forward, the sound of its footfall echoing loudly in the silence. I stumbled backward, almost dropping the flashlight, as the whispers grew louder, filling my ears, my mind, overwhelming my senses. "Leave," a voice hissed, louder and clearer than the rest. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the front of the store, my feet pounding against the cold tile floor. The shadows seemed to follow me, their whispers swirling around me, each word a threat, a promise, a warning. As I reached the front door, I glanced back one last time. The shadows were gone, and the store was silent once more. The lights flickered back to life, casting the store in an unsettlingly normal glow. But then I saw him. The old man was standing at the entrance, watching me with that same unsettling smile, his dark eyes piercing through me. "Until next time," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. I ran out, not stopping until I was in my car, locking the doors behind me. I looked back through the windshield, half expecting to see him standing there in the doorway. But the entrance was empty. I never went back to that Walmart, and to this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But sometimes in the quiet hours, I hear his voice echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of that night. Waiting. Watching. There's a part of every night shift that always feels a bit eerie. But my experience at Walmart had always been safe. Just me stocking shelves and zoning out to podcasts in the empty aisles. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until one night, that is. It started around 1:30 a.m. when the only sound in the store was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft rumble of the AC. I was restocking the pet supplies aisle when I heard what sounded like a child's laugh, faint, high-pitched, and out of place. I pulled out my earbuds and looked around, listening. Silence. I shrugged, put my earbuds back in, and kept working. But the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing down the aisles. I took my earbuds out again, but the laughter stopped. A chill trickled down my spine. Kids didn't come into the store at this hour, and we didn't get many customers on a weeknight, let alone children. Trying to shake it off, I moved to the toy section, convincing myself I'd imagined it. But there, scattered on the floor in the middle of the aisle, were several dolls, all turned over, their faces pressed to the ground. They hadn't been like that when I walked through earlier, and I was sure of it. I picked up one of the dolls, turning it over. It was one of those old-fashioned dolls with blinking eyes and a painted smile. As soon as I set it back on the shelf, its eyes opened and looked right at me. I jumped back, my pulse racing. It was just a doll, I reminded myself, just a trick of the lighting. I reached out to straighten the rest of the dolls, but as I did, I heard a soft voice behind me. "Do you want to play?" I froze. It sounded like a little girl, her voice hollow, echoing. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but the aisle was empty. My eyes darted around, scanning every shelf, every shadow, but there was no one. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the quiet buzz of the overhead lights. I backed out of the toy aisle, deciding I'd just stock something else until I could convince myself it was all in my head. I'd barely made it to the end of the aisle when I heard the laughter again, only this time it was louder, coming from all around me, filling the empty aisles. My chest tightened and I broke into a jog, heading for the front of the store. I planned to call my manager and maybe go home early for the night. But as I passed the electronics section, every TV flickered on, displaying static. One by one, the screens switched to the same image. A little girl with long, dark hair, standing alone in one of the aisles, staring directly into the camera. My breath caught. She was wearing a pale blue dress, torn and dirty, and her face was shrouded in shadows. Slowly, she lifted a hand and pointed at me, her eyes empty and hollow. Then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that made my skin crawl. I backed away, my legs shaky, but the TVs didn't turn off. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and her smile seemed to grow wider, stretching far too long across her face. I reached behind the counter and pulled the plug, cutting the power to the entire display, plunging the electronics section into darkness. I turned to leave, but there she was, standing at the end of the aisle. She was even closer now, her face pale and her eyes dark, like empty sockets. She tilted her head, her mouth twisting into that awful, unnatural grin. "Do you want to play?" she asked, her voice echoing, hollow and flat. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over myself. I didn't have to turn around to know she was following me, her footsteps soft but relentless. I could hear the faint patter of her bare feet against the cold tile floor, and with each step, that laughter grew louder, echoing through the aisles, bouncing off every surface. I didn't stop until I reached the break room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I could still hear her laughter outside, her voice taunting me from just beyond the door. "Don't you want to play just a little bit?" My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, dialing my manager. The line rang and rang, but no one picked up. I tried again, but all I got was static. The signal was dead. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. I held my breath, listening, waiting. The silence was worse somehow, thick and oppressive. Slowly, I opened the door just a crack, peeking out. The aisle was empty. There was no sign of her. I took a shaky step out of the break room, glancing around, and that's when I noticed something. A doll lying in the middle of the floor, facing up, its glassy eyes staring right at me. In its hand was a small piece of paper. I bent down carefully and picked it up. Scrawled in childish handwriting were the words, "I'll see you again soon." I dropped the doll, my heart hammering in my chest, and backed away. Without looking back, I bolted out of the store, leaving my shift unfinished. I quit that night and never looked back. But sometimes, even now in the dead of night, I hear that same high-pitched laughter echoing faintly as if she's still waiting, still watching. The overnight shift at Walmart was never particularly thrilling, but it paid the bills. My routine was predictable: unload the shipments, stock the shelves, check my phone for messages, and repeat until dawn. It was comforting in a way, at least until the night that changed everything. It started subtly. I was unpacking boxes in the home goods aisle when I noticed something odd. At the end of the aisle, standing perfectly still, was a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed in dark, shabby clothes, and he didn't seem like the type to be browsing Walmart in the middle of the night. His head was tilted slightly, and his eyes, it was hard to describe. They were hollow, unblinking, staring through me like he could see into something deeper. "Can I help you?" I called, forcing a friendly tone. He didn't respond, just kept watching me with that empty gaze. It wasn't the first time I'd dealt with strange customers at night, so I shrugged it off and went back to stocking the shelves. When I turned around again, he was gone. I figured he'd moved on, and I tried to forget about it. An hour passed. I was in the back of the store setting up a display when I heard the familiar squeak of a cartwheel. Slow, deliberate, one squeak at a time. I glanced down the aisle, expecting to see a coworker, but instead, it was him again. He was just standing there, hands resting on an empty shopping cart, staring. My skin prickled with unease. "Sir, are you lost?" I asked, keeping my distance. Still, he said nothing, just a blank stare fixed in my direction. I was starting to feel like maybe he was a sleepwalker, or worse, some kind of loiterer with less than innocent intentions. I stepped back and grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call security. But when I looked down the aisle again, he was gone. I walked down the aisles trying to spot him, but he had vanished into thin air. I shook off the strange encounter and returned to my tasks, but my nerves were shot. Every creak, every hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to send my heart racing. Eventually, I moved to the stockroom in the back of the store, hoping the closed walls would make me feel safer. I was organizing boxes when I heard something behind me, a low, raspy whisper. "Help me." I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. My hands started to tremble as I turned back to my boxes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time, closer. "Please, help me." I backed away from the boxes, my skin crawling. The whisper seemed to be coming from the dark corner of the room, just out of sight. I flicked on my flashlight, shining it toward the corner, and saw nothing. Just shadows, empty shelves, and rows of boxes. But the air felt heavier, colder. I turned to leave, but froze when I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway behind me. Slow, dragging footsteps like someone shuffling along with bare feet. I felt my chest tighten as I looked back. The man was there again, only he looked different this time. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and sickly, almost translucent. And his eyes, they were sunken, dark as if swallowed by shadows. He opened his mouth, a dry, cracked whisper escaping his lips. Don't leave me. I stumbled backward, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. My mouth was dry, and I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the room into a stuttering, nightmarish half-light. The man stepped closer, his mouth twitching into a twisted smile. "I've been here, waiting," he rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. "They never found me." My mind reeled as I tried to process his words. Who are you?" I managed to stammer, forcing myself to hold my ground. "They never found me," he repeated, his voice almost pleading. "Trapped, here, waiting." He took another step forward, and I saw it, blood staining his shirt, spreading across his chest. His skin was mottled, bruised, like he'd been left here for a long time. Something in the pit of my stomach twisted as I realized what he was saying. "Are you?" I could barely bring myself to ask the question. "Are you dead?" His expression changed, a flicker of pain crossing his face, and he nodded. "They never looked. They left me here, alone." The lights flickered again, and his face twisted into a mask of anger and despair. His voice dropped to a growl. "But you're here. You can't leave, just like me." With those words, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I scrambled backward, my hand fumbling for the door handle. I yanked it open and stumbled out, not looking back, not daring to see if he was following me. As I ran down the hallway, his voice echoed after me, growing louder and more frantic. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me here! Help me!" I burst out into the main store, gasping for air, the lights blindingly bright compared to the darkness of the stockroom. I found my manager, barely able to get the words out as I told him about the man, about the whispers. He gave me a strange look and agreed to check it out, probably thinking I was sleep-deprived or stressed. But when he came back, he looked pale, his eyes wide with confusion. He told me no one was back there, just a dusty, unused stockroom that hadn't been touched in years. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my things, clocked out, and left. I didn't come back for another shift after that night. Sometimes, though, late at night, I still hear his voice echoing in my mind, pleading, whispering, "They never found me.